Hey, we're live. Yeah, welcome to History Chats. Um, it's an interesting day. What with the weather happening. If you're watching this after the fact, this is the uh, Thursday the 22nd, I guess. So, bit of a snowstorm, but I'm sticking around a little later to make this happen. So, hopefully, we'll get started. Looks like everything is working. I did get lost making a last second edit, so I'm gonna give myself just a second here. I can do this. Hey. Yeah, I think we're ready to go. So I'm just gonna jump right in, I think. Yeah, why not? This month we are wrapping up what is the end of the year 2022 with kind of last thoughts about the Celebrate Wausau, the 150th anniversary of the city of Wausau. And the city of Wausau, of course, is um, a lot of 150 years in the grand scheme of things is not that long, but it is surprisingly difficult to try to sum it up in one image, which is kind of what we've been trying to do. So instead of doing one image, we're doing 5 images. Today we're doing part 4. So there's one more after this. If you haven't gone back and watched the others that we've done up to this point, that's okay. It's not serialized. It doesn't mean that you have to see the last one to see this one. Yeah. So we're just going to jump in. Today we're going to be doing part 4, like I said, and I used this image. This is essentially, so part 4, we're up to the modern era, or mid-century, I guess you'd say it. Modern is the wrong word. I keep thinking mid-century modern, but that's a decoration style. That's an artistic style. Some overlap, I guess. Mid-century. So 1950s, we're after World War II. Okay, we're back to peacetime, sort of the sort of Americana sort of century here, where we, from 1950 to 1980-ish. The edges are a little undefined. We kind of just, there's a little bit of overlap, but that's okay. That's what we're doing today. I picked this image. As always, it's a lot harder to do later you go because there's a lot more images. But this is one that I think summed it up pretty well. So we are on Grand Avenue, if you can't tell. There's some similar giveaways here, and we'll go into depth about what this shows and the history behind everything here. But we're on Grand Avenue in Wausau. And actually, if we go look at, this is what's on the back of the original photograph. It's part of a series of photographs that were taken. You can see the handwritten here on the right side. I know it's skewed here. But 2002, that's when it was donated to us, and it's donated from the city engineering department, which is interesting because if we remove that, and this is physically what we received back in 2002 before we wrote our session information on it. It was actually taken by the police department, and at some point it went to the city engineering department. But the police department makes sense. They were the ones that took the photograph. It seems like during this period they do a little bit of that here and there, as they are maybe more likely to be out and about. But anyway, taken from the center of the street in front of 804 Grand Avenue, April 1964. And actually, let's just pull up. Let's just put that in here. 804 Grand Avenue. So that's what we're dealing with here. So, I mean, again, you might be able to know where we are. There's some giveaways. If we go street view here, you can kind of see it. Google doesn't necessarily drive down the middle of the street, understandably, so it's not going to be quite the same angle, but this is more or less what we're looking at in the modern era. So as I said, some similar things, some other things as well that have changed. But this is roughly the neighborhood. This is the stretch that we're looking at in this image. Again, at some point, the city engineering department got their hands on it. Probably the police department took the photograph for this project, is put in the records for the engineering department, and then after 40 years, they decided to give them to us. And we've been, preserving them and keeping them in our records ever since. So this is the photograph. Why did I pick this photograph is an interesting, I'm not sure how to articulate. There's a lot of things happening here, but I would say that if nothing else, I think this is, take these off. I think this is shows a city of Wausau in transition, which it certainly was, and it's always in transition to something or another. But I think there's enough here of the old and the new and in the process that I think makes a lot of sense. So probably the thing that caught my attention, the reason that I decided to go with this image is partially because of this building over here, fire department. So the central fire station, originally the first fire station looked like this. They sometimes called it the fire barn, where they kept a horse, and I don't even know if the horse was actually owned by the city or something. I'm not sure how they got their horses, but the engine followed into your fire department. This is on Courthouse Square, the 400 block today, more commonly known. Over the years, of course, they've expanded as it professionalize and expand with the city of Wausau. There's new firehouses and stations that are spread across the area, which kind of makes sense if you're going to be driving one of these things. You don't want to have to cross the entirety of the city to answer the call of, it's a fire. You want to be able to be responsive and be there pretty quickly. So that's kind of what they do. And, there's another one here. I don't know what this one calls. I remember what number this one was, but this one's number 3, Bridge Street and 8th Street. It's just an example. This is something that they did well into the 20th century, and still kind of it makes a lot of sense today. But the main thing is that in the middle of the 20th century, in the 40s and 50s, especially after the war is over, we're getting back to sort of life. Increasingly, this is a community that is going to be based around automobiles. And things like fire service, becomes more complicated as they take on more responsibilities and roles. And so, it becomes necessary to have a maybe centralized location for all of that to happen. And so in 1962, this was drawn up. They started work building the new fire station, which is the Wausau Central Fire Station, which is still what it's known as today. Described in this picture, I think this is captioned the new ultra-modern fire station. And it does have a lot of those elements, sort of the 1950s into the 60s, this sort of municipal building, but also, it's a little different. It's a lot different than, what we had before. These brick buildings with, big, you still have the big garage, the doors to get the trucks in and out. But this part over here, it's very angular, it's very rectangular in that modernist sense. It's using brick, but also a lot of aluminum and steel and glass, these big walls of windows. It's still pretty early in the process in 62, so it's not quite as integrated as they would do today, but still, kind of looking forward into the new second half of the 20th century with optimism. Yeah. Now you may be wondering, what about the rest of the building? If you're don't remember, for a long time that this was it, right? This is an aerial from about 1964, maybe a little bit later, showing that intersection. And actually, so if we look at it today, go back to Google Maps. Obviously there's the police department here, the public safety building. That gets added on. Well, that doesn't happen until much later. This is the opening of the current building in 1998. Although it is worth noting that there was an attempt to try and centralize a lot of the public safety, including the police department, into one place as well throughout the 1950s into the 60s. And there was talk about, maybe integrating it in as part of the fire as well. However, one thing that kind of sidelines this is Employers Mutual, or Wausau Insurance, as many of you may know it, at the time Employers. They built that brand new facility on the west side, up on the hill, which freed up their old building, built in the 1940s, for the city hall. So a lot of the services ended up going there, and the pressure, the need to build a centralized building kind of gets put off for a while. Anyway. Otherwise, we can see here a lot of residential houses. Some of these are still here, some of them are not. The Texaco station on the corner here, that's gone, of course, but something that many people maybe still remember. Of course, the whole Thomas Street area is going to change, here and there because of the bridge situation. Maybe we'll talk about that in the future, about bridges and sort of some of the other stuff here. So I'm not going to get too sidetracked here, but I do want to, I think, next talk about what's on the bottom left here, which is Hammond Park. Hammond Park has been a fixture for the 20th century, really, here of this neighborhood. It was built in the shadow of what was then the breweries, which we'll talk about in a second. The breweries had been built there in the 1860s and throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 1800s. This had been a popular location for outdoor excursions. It was sort of parks. Frank Schubert had a park here called Schubert's Park, sort of a beer garden type deal. Later, Grand Avenue Park or Grand Park. Eventually, the Rooter Brewing Company, after a fire, ends up rebuilding a little bit here, but it ends up in the hands of a woman named Susan Hammond Ray, who decides to develop it into a community park for the neighborhood, which she dedicates to her father, Benjamin Hammond, thus Hammond Park. And so then this becomes a community space, and she donates it to the city of Wausau, and they've run it as a city park ever since. So here's another postcard here from James Colby, a little later for Colby. But yeah, you've got the very distinctive band shell built here, along with some playground equipment and things like that. Again, Hammond Park for the children. I don't know how many children necessarily play there on a regular basis these days. Things have evolved. The neighborhood's changed a bit, but certainly still something there. And if we go back to the maps, again, there's the band shell. Still maintained. Google seems to think that this is part of Hammond Park, which I think is also true, but I'm not entirely sure where the limits where we get into Oak Park. But yeah, certainly another community space that a lot of people remember fondly, and to this day. Anyway, so that's over here. That's this wooded area that pretty much remains. There's that Texaco sign for the corner on this near side, and we kind of covered the intersection in the immediate focus here. So let's keep kind of going now. Let's talk about the breweries. So there's two major breweries that are built, as the German immigrants start to arrive in the 1850s into the 60s. They bring their thirst for the traditional celebrations and social lives, having a stein of beer, and in general, as the population grew, there was many of them were thirsty, and so a brewery gets built by George Reuter in 1860. The south end of town on what was then Town Line Road, heading down to Mosinee through Schofield. And then later in that decade, Frank Matthey, another German immigrant, decides to throw in on this too. I don't know where the original structures were, if they built literally right next to each other, or if they just kind of were on the same area and they just kind of grew. I know a lot of these buildings were changed quite a bit. For example, in 1892, the Reuter Brewing facility burns down in a fire, also destroys the park nearby. They rebuild. So a lot of this is not what if you see very early pictures of Reuter, the structure is a little different. I don't think Matthey was affected there. Matthey further north, Reuter further south. We're looking kind of northwest here along Grand Avenue. I also just want to point out this square building and our immediate presence here. I don't know when this postcard was taken, if this was active still as Columbia Hall. This was built by the Reuter Brewing Company. It had a big dance floor, a bowling alley in the basement, housed a lot of the social activities for many of especially the German community. Until about New Century, somewhere in there, 1903-4, they decided to kind of pivot. Another fire ravaged it in 1906, and it becomes part of the bottling and office facilities. But actually one of the buildings that lasts longest out of all of this. As for the Matthey side, which is kind of what this is, Reuter, I had a hard time parsing exactly when things happened, so I'm going to be kind of vague here for the sake of getting through it. But Matthey side of it is still here. Reuter gets kind of torn down over the years, but this remains. By the 1960s, it's not in the best of shape, which is fairly clear here as looking at this, but it doesn't stop, an attempt to try to rejuvenate it. Again, this is from 1964. This is part of that series that the the police department took, and then it went to the city. We talked about the engineering department and all that. The former brewery was repurposed by the Snap family for the Snap Electrical, and made an attempt to try to rejuvenate and sort of repurpose that space. Ultimately, they found some success, but not super long-term, and the building itself was torn down in 1977, the last of the breweries. Or at least that side of the breweries. Wausau Brewing on the west side is certainly its own story. This is also from 1964, a little bit later in the year, though, as you can tell by the change to the road. So there's the what's left of the Matthey, and you can see Columbia Hall, or what was originally Columbia Hall, still standing right next to Hammond Park. Now, crossing over to the other side, you might notice this interesting the Office bar. Yeah. So this is actually its predecessor. The taverns and bars of Wausau often change names. Sometimes, a couple times over a decade, it might have 2 or 3 different names. It seems like in the 1950s into the early 60s, it was known as Avenue Bar, which is what this picture is labeled as. So this is the interior of that. But in the 1960s, about the time, at 1963, late 63, a guy named Donald Ott takes over the running of the bar, and he is going to rename it the Office Bar. He is going to eventually sell that building, or the operation, to a guy named Michael Murray, who will rebrand it slightly a bit later. This is in the 1970s. It was sort of the Irish-themed Murray's Office Bar, and then eventually they just kind of rename it by 1977 as Patty's Pub. I'm not sure. I didn't follow that thread back too far, but obviously, by the 1980s into the 90s, it no longer a tavern, and it's replaced by the police department and the parking lot and sort of that block there. What's interesting, though, is that some of you may be familiar with the fact that there is today, if you go down to Schofield, there is an Office Bar and Tavern on Grand Avenue. I was surprised by this, and I thought, oh, maybe they moved. So I was trying to figure out when they moved. At the time that this picture was taken, or well, not this picture, but let's say, this picture was taken. Actually, no, this wouldn't have been a bar at that point. In the 1970s, it was run by a woman named Viola Lehman, or Lerman? Lehman. Vi's Corner Inn. And that gets sort of used throughout the 1970s. A guy named Jeffrey Otto purchases it in 76, 77, and he leases it out to a number of people. It is known as Al's Poorhouse for a little while, J&R Avenue Bar, and eventually it appears that Otto is the one who rebrands it as The Office in the 1980s, which is surprising. I was under the assumption then, and here's the part that screwed me up for a while. In my notes, I was like, oh, they must be related. It's the same guy. And then I realized, oh, Jeffrey, Donald. And then I didn't realize my notes, Ott and Otto, look very similar. I don't honestly know. And maybe if you watching this have some insight that I don't, be curious to know a little bit more about this. I didn't have enough time to really flesh out the realities of the story of where the name The Office, if it was, they were connected or whether it was just parallel thinking. It wasn't, as I was originally thinking, the same family or something like that. Although maybe they're connected, I'm not sure. But Ott and Otto, not the same person. Anyway, interesting little diversion. Part of the life of Grand Avenue and its changing environment and shifting over the years. It was a place where there were a lot of restaurants and taverns and bars over the years, and some of them have become fixed in our minds as this is that institution. Some of them come and go. But there's change at foot. Okay, so going back to Grand Avenue, though, this is an aerial picture from 1922, and it shows the breweries and sort of the large scale. You can see it's quite the operations. At this point in 1922, these are not active bars or breweries because of Prohibition, but eventually they are going to merge. They had merged just before Prohibition to become the American Brewing Company. Then Prohibition kind of brings that to an end. They reform after Prohibition is repealed, and you can start, selling beer again and consuming it. But that lasts until about 1950. That was under Matthew Reuter, and then finding other purposes. That becomes the thing in the second half of the 20th century. But I also want to show this because it also ties us nicely to the church over here. So this is St. Mary's, still around. This beautiful, iconic steeple here, and the church, the Gothic building built in 1890. Although the congregation itself, the people who were part of the parish, they got started in 1861. So I believe, as far as I can tell, this is the oldest Catholic church in town, even if this specific church itself wasn't built until the 1890s. But obviously there's more here. There's the school that was built here. I don't remember if this is the one that gets replaced or if this is the one that replaces the previous one. Did a video about this about 2 years ago about Sanborn maps if you want to know more about the specific neighborhood. But again, just looking at this picture, you can see very prominently kind of poking over the trees here is that steeple at St. Mary's. But we got to talk about the courthouse because the very end here you can see the courthouse peeking there. The courthouse, another iconic building, another one that was attempting to be very modern in replacing the building that had previously filled that purpose. If we go, so the original courthouse was on the 400 block. That's where this building comes into play. By the 1850s, or 1950s, I should say, hey, we need a change. And there was a decision, finally came to be to the point where they decided to replace it. And so they built this building, replacing the old, brick granite structure, which, is a shame. It is an iconic building. It's probably, as it turns out, not the best structure to have a functioning courthouse in the 20th century. It's hard to heat and cool and all of that sort of stuff. I can't imagine trying to get Wi-Fi signals or anything to work in, well, I would imagine it's a bit of a challenge in the modern era. But regardless, they ended up building this building here. Again, maybe I think fair to say this is doesn't have quite the same character as those early structures that they had, but it is very interesting as well. Built in 1953, 1954, get up and running. Again, that very sort of mid-century modernist architecture. Let's have some very square buildings, some very rectangular, still kind of using some of the old windows, not quite those integrated window walls, although the steps here, that big entryway, certainly kind of alluding to what is to come in terms of the architecture of buildings. And it remains to this day, this is our courthouse. Added on, the annex, the jail courthouse here, or the correctional facility, repurposed the block a little bit here and there. But this is essentially when this all gets started. And its location is, just with the fire station, not completely out of the blue. Because Wausau is changing, and transportation is an important part of this story. As we get back to life after World War II, more and more and more people are going to be driving automobiles, and they're going to be wanting to go where they need to go. And now we're going to have to kind of, like in the 1920s, nobody was probably thinking about the long-term consequences of automobiles. But now we're going to have to deal with traffic. And one of the things is the interstate highway system. So this is a picture of 1968, I think, showing the highway bypass 51 and 29. Now, to this day, Grand Avenue is still Business 51, right? Business 51. It was just 51 for a long time. If you wanted to go from Schofield or Stevens Point or wherever, you'd go through the city of Wausau, go down Grand Avenue, cross over, and then you'd take Merrill Avenue up to Merrill. But with the bypass, with Highway 51 being built, it streamlines that process and hopefully alleviates some of the pressure on the city infrastructure. And yet, not too long after that, that's like 1960, 61, I think was when that happens, around 1960. A couple years later, now we get to work, just because there's not that much traffic, as much traffic relative to when, everything was going through Grand Avenue, they get to work, redoing it, expanding it, widening it. And this is the reason that these pictures, by the way, were taken, showing the progress, the before and after in 1964. So this is looking at that intersection from the courthouse, looking through those front windows. You can see them hard at work. Some more pictures here. This is a sort of partway through and then the end product. I think something that's really interesting about this is it is I think it's an attempt to try to deal with the increasing traffic. Despite the highway being rerouted, more and more people are driving around, and Grand Avenue is, they're very aware that this is going to be one of the main hubs. And going forward, we're going to see that. There's an article from about a decade later, 10, 15 years later, making very clear that like Grand Avenue is a real problem area. A lot of the traffic goes through here. This talking about the 10 most dangerous corners where the accidents happen. 3 of the 10 in 1968, 3 of the 10 most dangerous intersections were on Grand Avenue. And they said that statistically, 1 in every 10 accidents occurs on Grand Avenue. And that's a lot. A lot of people taking it. And partly because it flourishes as a center for commerce and transportation. You got the picture here. You can see the Kmart, Firestone, Ben Franklin. Saw going back to the location of the office here. You got Taco Bell. That becomes a real popular place. There's a hamburger stands like Chips and McDonald's had a McDonald's there. So there's a lot of places that people are trying to go. And I think what's interesting is it also is a part of life. Like despite the traffics, the dangers, Grand Avenue in that modern era, whether we're talking about 1964 or the next 20, 30 years, even arguably to this day, it is still a very important part of the city of Wausau. I just think this is funny. I remember being in high school and having to choose, when they ask you to fill out like, who's the most likely to succeed or who's got the best hair or whatever. One of the things that I had to fill out was who's the most likely to cruise Grand Avenue. And I thought, what does that mean? Maybe I must be hanging out with the wrong people. We didn't, my friend group did not cruise Grand Avenue very often, but throughout the 80s or I'm assuming into the 80s, certainly in the 90s, they pick it up in the paper a lot in the 90s. This is from 1999, but I saw like wedding announcements saying, "Hey, the bride and groom, they met cruising Grand Avenue." So I think looking forward, this isn't just a picture of what this moment looks like. It is a picture documenting the change that is coming. The fact that a lot of this is going to disappear or evolve over the years, but also some of it stays the same. And ultimately, this is going to be one of those areas. There's a lot of places in Wausau. As always, you struggle trying to figure out what picture to sum up the entirety of a city that's become so expansive as we do in the 20th century. But I thought that this was one of those that does a good job of talking about it. So if nothing else, there's some interesting stories, and I got to learn a little bit more about some of the things here, like the fire department building and the office bar, and hopefully some of that was interesting and learned something from you. Next week, we are hopefully going to be doing concluding this and bringing us to an end in 2022 here. I am not honestly sure what I'm going to. Usually, this is where I would show. Here's a teaser of what we're doing next. A little clip of the image, but I don't actually have that ready to go yet. Be kind of interesting. We'll see what we put together. We'll do something. If nothing else, we'll talk. We'll kind of sum this all up, and we'll talk about Wausau pictured, and do our best to try to picture the modern era. But yeah, hope you join us for that. I know it's in the middle of the holidays there, but is what it is. We'll make it work. And yeah, thanks for joining me. Just gonna check to see if there are any questions or everything while we're live here. You're all staying warm and safe here. Okay, doesn't look like there are any questions. That's quite all right. Yeah. Well, we'll see you next week then. Again, hope we all stay warm and safe in this holiday blizzard that we're going through. Or if you're watching later, hopefully all that happens. Happy holidays, and we'll see you next week for some more history chats. Thanks for watching.